if we've been saved, released out of that after we've died, before we knew Jesus, then no, you're not coming back into it. If you're talking about a state on earth of living in bondage to religious control, well, you can always be living in that. And that's what Paul was talking about in Galatians. You foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? You started off in grace and now you're going back under the law. That's just religious bondage. It's nothing to do with hell, the future. It's just living in bondage in the present state, which of course you don't need to do because we're not under the law. So we don't have to fulfill the law. We're living in grace, and God's grace is sufficient for every situation. So again, when you're talking about dogs returned to vomit, you're talking about a covenantal thing, not an individual thing there. So it's really talking about, coming into the knowledge of this truth, but living in the new covenant and then mixing it with old covenant. And that's the problem. That is like vomit. If you're living in the new covenant, grace, mercy, and love of God, and you keep mixing in old covenant, it's like you're eating terrible stuff, which is never going to produce any good fruit in your life, and it's horrible. So don't see it as backsliding. This is not really talking about an individual. It's more talking about living in the bondage of a religious system. You have been forgiven. You have been reconciled. You've been made righteous. You didn't do that. He did it for you. It's already done. Therefore, you can't lose that. It's a state that he's created you to be in. You cannot live in that state in your own mind by alienating and trying to live in your own strength and live under your own understanding, which means you won't benefit from the reality of what he's done. But it doesn't mean he hasn't done it, and you can't ever lose that. So the reality is more in your mind. You do not have to see yourself backsliding. You're in a process of transformation by the renewing of your mind. So you're not pressed in the old covenant religious mold or in your old lost identity mold, but coming into the fullness of sonship. That's a process which you're in. Don't think about the future. You're already saved, forgiven, reconciled. You already have all those things done, no accusation against you. God keeps no record of wrongs. The problem is you're keeping a record of your own wrong. Therefore, you're not living in the forgiveness that he has because you're not focusing on forgiveness. You're focusing on the negative of behavior. So focus on being in the sense of forgiveness and love. That's the key. And I would encourage you to think more about that. And there's a little comment that I saw online and I've used a few times recently. It says this: I am realizing that as long as I have a sin consciousness, I will always see something wrong with me, big or small, that God is not pleased with. That will always bring guilt and shame, which makes me run from God. God does not bring that. Love, grace, and righteousness consciousness will always bring peace and joy. God is always smiling over us. So if you think about it from those terms, your consciousness and what you're thinking on is really what is controlling how you're living. And particularly with the idea of guilt, shame, condemnation, that is self-condemnation from you thinking your behavior is separating yourself from God. God is never separated from you. You're separating from him because you don't feel worthy enough because of what you're doing. There is no guilt, shame, condemnation. God just wants you to live in the fullness of his forgiveness and realize that you are a new creation in Christ. Your old identity has been restored from Jesus and God's perspective. Just choose to live in the new covenant grace rather than old covenant law.